This video is going to walk through number 2 of the Chapter 4 homework. Now, since number 2 is the first homework problem that's on the solution set for Chapter 4, I want to take a second and talk a little bit about how these problems are laid out, because it's a little bit different than what we did in previous chapters. What I've done is broken it down where it's applicable, at least into 2 separate solution sets. Right underneath the problem, what you'll find is that I've calculated the answer to the problem using nothing but the formula in algebra. So I'm not using any special functionality on the financial calculator. And then below that, I'll usually draw a line, and below that, you'll find how to use the time value keys to solve the same problem. So where it's possible, not every problem can utilize the time value keys. Where it's possible, I'll give you 2 ways to solve the problem. On an exam, you're free to use whichever one you want. The reason I did that is that it's truly, truly helpful if the first time you go through these problems, to just use the formula in the algebra first and don't try and use the time value keys on your calculator. If you get a handle for what's actually going on with the math, and therefore you get a handle on what your calculator is doing for you, it's going to make it so much easier in the long run. So I know it's a lot of time to invest up front to go through and calculate the algebra first, rather than learning to use your calculator. But if you go through the problems at least once just using the algebra before you start trying to use your calculator, I can promise you you're going to save yourself an awful lot of time in the long run, when later on you're just trying to use the time value keys and you don't know what to put where because you're not sure which calculator is actually doing for you. So I encourage you to do the algebra first. Okay, so number 2, let's go ahead and dig into the problem. Number 2 reads, assume the total cost of a college education will be $285,000 when your child enters college in 22 years. You presently have $35,000 to invest. What annual rate of interest must you earn in your investment to cover the cost of your child's college education? Okay, so the formula we're going to use in this problem and almost every single one in Chapter 4 is this guy right here, which I hope you've gone back and read Chapter 4 before you jump into the problems, because it's going to make life a lot easier for you. But if you have, you're intimately familiar with this equation already, where PV, your present value, is equal to 1 plus R, which is our interest rate, raised to the T, or T is our term here, the number of periods. In Chapter 4, it's all years, so it's going to be the number of years, equals FV, or future value. So we take what we call a lump sum present value and grow it at some given interest rate for some given number of years into a future value lump sum. So for number 2, what we'll find for this problem and for most of the other ones is that we're given 3 pieces of this equation and we've got to solve for the 4th. We're given that we have $35,000 to invest. That's our present value. That's what we have today. So we're going to plug that in for PV. We're looking for our annual rate of interest. So 1 plus R here, I've left R just as R because that's what we're going to solve for. Our T is 22 years. We want to grow $35,000 for 22 years, and we want it to grow to a future value of $285,000. So we plugged in 3 pieces, and we want to solve for the 4th here. So let's jump in. We've got to try and isolate this R. So I'm going to divide 35,000 over to the other side. So we've got 1 plus R to the 22nd equals 285,000 divided by 35,000. And I went ahead and did that division, and that's 8.1429. Now, a word of caution right here. I wrote that down so you can see what I was doing, and it'd make it a little bit easier. But when you actually calculate this, you don't want to write down 8.14 or even 8.1429 and then go on from there. You want to store that value in your calculator. When we get down to calculating things like interest rates, small rounding errors will make a big difference in the end, and your answer may wind up being quite a bit off. And I'll show you what I mean when we plug this into the calculator. So now we're down to 1 plus R to the 22nd equals 8.1429. And we've got to get at this R, which means we've got to get rid of this exponent up here. And if you're like me, it's been a while since you've had algebra and you may or may not remember how to do that. What we've got to do to get rid of this exponent is take the 22nd root of both sides of the problem. I didn't write it down here, but what I've done to cancel out this 22nd is I took the 22nd root of 1 plus R to the 22nd, which just drops the exponent completely. They cancel out. And that's equal to the 22nd root of 8.1429. Now, you're probably looking at this and going, how am I going to make my calculator do that? You're right, unless you're using some kind of graphing calculator where you can enter that, you're not going to be able to. Right. But what you've got to remember is that the 22nd root of 8.1429, another way to write that is 8.1429 raised to the 1 over 22. Okay, so these two are the exact same thing, just written a different way. And this you can make your calculator do. So let's look at how to do that on the BA2+. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and do that division so I don't wind up having a rounding error. The 285 divided by 35,000 equals 8.1429. And my calculator is storing, I think, back to 13 decimal places. Okay, so I don't want to clear that out. I want to leave that number in there. What I want to do is raise this to the 1 over the 22. And here's how I'm going to do that. I'm going to hit the y over x key right here above the 9. And what that's telling my calculator is this number that's in the display right now, 8.1429, I want to raise that to something. Right? And the next number that I enter is what it's going to raise it to. I want to raise it to 1 over the 22nd. So I can't just enter that in. What I'm going to do is put it inside parentheses, and so the calculator will do the division for me first, and then do the exponent. Okay, so I'm going to open my parentheses. That's the open parentheses right above the 7 key. And I'm going to do 1 divided by 22. And then I'm going to close the parentheses. That's the key right above the 8. Okay, so now what you see in the display is 0.0455. That is 1 divided by 22. It did the division inside the parentheses. Now I have to hit the equal key. And so I hit the equals key, and now what it's done is taken that 8.1429 and raised it to the 1 over 22. And the result is 1.1000. Right, so where we're at now is 1 plus r equals 1.1. So we've still got this 1 to deal with over here. We want to solve for r. So we just subtract 1 over to the left-hand side, and we've got r equals 1.1 minus 1. So we do that subtraction, and we're left with r equals 0.1, or remember this is a rate, right, a percentage. So when we see 0.1, that's the same thing as 10%. Okay, so that's the algebra. Now let's figure out how to solve this problem using the time value keys in our calculator. Okay, and what I've done here, I'll draw your attention to this timeline first. Anytime I'm using the time value keys for the calculator, I'll always draw this timeline for myself, just so I can keep in mind what I'm actually doing here, because it's real easy to get lost in trying to use your calculator and forget what you're trying to solve for the problem. All right, so what I've got here is we start at time period 0 as my first tick mark, and I've got $35,000. Okay, what I want to do is go out 22 years. So I started making tick marks for year 1, year 2, year 3, and on out, out to year 22. And at the end of year 22, I want to be left with $285,000. And what I want to know is what interest rate is going to allow me to do that. All right, so the way I write down the keystrokes for the BA2+ is I list the time value keys, which is this row of keys right here, the third row from the top. On the newer calculators, they're gray. Even on the older ones, they're a slightly less black color, I think. Okay, and they start with N, goes to I over Y, goes to PV, goes to PMT, and then FV. I write them vertically instead of horizontally. I start with N, then I over Y, then PV. So they're written in the same order they appear on your calculator. And then I just write down what you're going to enter for each one of those keys. Okay, and where you see a question mark is the one key that we're going to solve for. Okay, in order for the time value keys to work, we have to fill in every single one of those, have to put in a value for every single one of those keys except for one of them. Okay, so here, N corresponds to our T, and that's going to be 22. Okay, in fact, before we get there, let me say this about the time value keys. They're like memory. Okay, they're like memory functions on any other calculator. Even if you turn your calculator off and turn it back on, whatever you stored in those time value keys is still going to be there. So before you do any problems with the time value keys, I want you to hit second, right above the N, and then clear TVM, which was the FV key. And what that does is clear out any values that are in the time value keys from a previous problem that you may have worked. So now they're all set to 0. Okay, so now let's enter these numbers. It's a little bit backwards from what you would normally think. What we've got to do is put the number in first. So if we want to store 22 for N, we're going to hit 22. We'll see 22 on the display. And then we're going to press N. Okay, we're going to see N equals 22. You see the decimal places behind it, we know that we've stored the value. Okay, I over y is what we're looking for, so we're going to skip over that key for now. P over y equal to 1 is what we put that in our initial calculator setup. If you haven't watched that video, I recommend you go back and do it now and make sure your calculator's set up the right way. Okay, now let's go to present value, is 35,000. So we're going to enter 35,000, do the number first, and then press the PV key. And we'll see PV equals 35,000 with our decimal places. So we'll see the decimal places, we know the calculator stored it. Payment we're not going to use in any of these problems. So we're going to enter 0 in payment, make sure that guy's 0. And future value is going to be negative in this case, okay? And that's just it's the algorithm that's running in the background in your calculator. If there's no payments, either your present value or your future value, one of them has got to be negative. One's got to be positive and one's got to be negative. And for Chapter 4, right now it doesn't matter which one's which. You pick. It's not going to make a difference in the answer. But in order for it to work, one of them's got to be negative. I've chosen to make future value negative. So I'm going to enter 285,000 for 285,000. I'm going to hit the plus minus key to make that guy negative. Okay, and then I'm going to press the future value button. Okay, so now I've got value stored for future value, payment, PV, and N. I can solve for I over Y, which is R in the formulas. Okay, it's our interest rate. So the way that I do that is I hit CPT, which stands for compute, and then I over Y key. And what I can see is I over Y, which is R, is equal to 10.0016. So we've got some rounding issues here when we calculate it as decimals, but not enough to give us any trouble. Okay, one thing worth noting here on the interest rate, your calculator and any other financial calculator that I know of assumes that when you do I over Y, you're looking for an interest rate. So it goes ahead and gives it to you in percentage terms. So when we solve for the decimal up here, we use the algebra, we found 0.1. And we had to know that that was 10%. When your calculator gives you back I over Y, it's already in percentage terms for you. So when you see 10.00, that's 10%. Okay, that's not 1,000%. So keep that in mind when you're solving for R.